And what we know is that over 63% of people have had an adverse childhood experience in their lifetime, just one. Oftentimes we have more than one.
But the good news is that it's an opportunity and an edge for us if we're willing to integrate it and resolve it and heal it within ourselves. Your leadership edge is the growth that's calling to you. We can stay stunted in our past if we're not willing to look at these traumas. And so what Lisa and I are working on articulating is, just the potential that can be unlocked and the healing that can happen, not just within one person, but within a group, if we're willing to look and be with it and allow it to heal.
Welcome to What's Possible, where leadership thrives. I'm Ilene Schaffer, and I'm glad you're here. Behind every powerhouse communicator and relationship builder is a strategic thinker who leads with curiosity. Because of that, we believe that your journey to becoming the best leader starts with you. How can we leverage our personal histories, the good stuff, and the challenges to enhance our leadership? This is the question we'll be answering today. We are diving deep into a topic that's pivotal, yet often overlooked and sometimes even hidden in our professional environments. We're looking at trauma. We'll explore how traumatic experiences can lead to personal and professional growth. Joining me are Lisa Zigarmi and Stella Grizont, experts who believe in harnessing the lessons from our past to forge stronger, more authentic leadership paths. Lisa, an organizational psychologist, leadership coach, and regular contributor to Harvard Business Review, and Stella, an executive coach and best-selling author of The Work Happiness Method, bring a wealth of experience in turning personal challenges into leadership strengths. They're here to share how trauma can serve as a hidden gift, enriching both our work and our lives. We'll delve into practical strategies that can help leaders use their deepest experiences to foster environments of empathy, innovation, and inclusivity. Let's find out what's possible when we embrace our entire selves in our pursuit of excellence. I'm Ilene Schaffer. Let's dive on in. Lisa and Stella, I'm so happy to welcome both of you back. You've both been on the podcast before, but separately. So how fun to have the two of you here today.
So fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilene. Looking forward to the magic.
Our listeners have had the opportunity to get to hear from each of you separately. Lisa, we had a great one talking about just embodied leadership and the impact of our body on our leadership. And Stella, of course, you had your newly released book, The Work Happiness Method. And so it's fun to bring you together on a totally different topic. But before we dive into that topic, in case our listeners missed one or the other of your podcasts, I'm going to ask you to just give us a snippet of who you are. So Lisa, let's start with you.
I am an organizational psychologist and a leadership coach. I am really passionate about helping leaders be in their bodies and use the intelligence of their bodies and their spirits as they support others and create the conditions for people to work really well and productively. That includes really being skillful with their emotions. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Yeah, that's me. I was not prepared to do that.
Well,
they can X that out.
No, we're keeping it. You did a beautiful job. Stella, it's your turn.
So I'm an executive coach and author, and I would say where I spend most of my time is helping people realize how powerful they are and how they can work happier and live better lives by learning the same things Lisa talked about, is like learning how to really be in their bodies, listen to themselves, know what really matters to them and how they want to show up. And so even when the world is as it is right now, we all have more control than we may think to feel more alive in our everyday.
And I'm going to have us talk about how the two of you got together on this topic. However, before we do that, you all have a really special friendship. You met while in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania in the MAP program, so the Master's in Applied Positive Psychology. And I want to know what each of you saw in the other person that was the seed to this beautiful friendship.
Oh my God. Well, I'm going to cry.
That's okay. People have cried before on this show.
Well, I will tell you, when I was in MAP, ironically, I was studying the science of happiness. I really felt like I was tested because while I was studying the science of happiness, I canceled a wedding that was about a month out. I was engaged to someone and I canceled it. And also, I felt like I was in a free fall with my career because my business wasn't going as I had planned, and I ended up moving back into my parents' house. And during that time, Lisa and I were put in the same cohort for some projects, and I really didn't know Lisa at all. Like, we maybe had one session, and she had gotten word that I had canceled my wedding. And she called me and she said, "What can I do? How can I help you? Do you want me to make calls? Do you want me to help you return gifts?" And I just felt, I just witnessed someone being so caring and loving and showing up with practical support, but such a big heart. And It didn't matter that we didn't know each other. I just felt this beautiful care emit from her. And I noticed that, and that gave me hope. I was like, wow, I feel completely disconnected in so many parts of my life, but here is a point of connection that I have. And here's the beauty of humanity, like right here in front of me. Someone who I have no connection with is being so loving. So it all started from that point for me.
Oh my gosh, what a beautiful story. Thank you. Oh, Lisa.
I love you, Stella. The interesting thing about that, Ilene, is I know I did that, but it doesn't really have a place in me. I'm so happy it had a gigantic impact on Stella. I think I had it to give, so I gave it freely, and it didn't seem like I didn't remember that until Stella told me that early in our friendship. The seed for me with Stella is the magnanimous nature of her spirit. So I think like when you're with Stella, what you recognize is that she holds space for what is not seen or heard or sensed with the five senses. And she believes it's as legitimate. And I want to be with people like that. It's kind of hard to give language to that. So I'm trying to do the best I can right now. But essentially, Stella is a mystic. She's someone who believes that there are things outside of what we know and intellectualize. And she sees them as legitimate and important components to life. And I want to be with someone like that. I find it incredibly attractive. So she's always able to hold space for me and what I can articulate and what I can't articulate. She hears and sees things that are invisible or inaudible. And I think that's the power of her friendship and the power of her coaching.
Well, I'm going to keep crying then. That was so beautiful. Thank you. And I would say the same. when I think Lisa and I had a recognition of that in each other. And we've, she continues to create that allowance for me. And actually her friendship has given me the space to trust all of that more and more. So, I really don't feel I would be who I am in this world without Lisa's friendship.
God, honey. Thank you.
So beautiful. Well, and I imagine our listeners take a moment and think of that person in your life, that wonderful person who is your special person. And it might be nice to let them know what that seed was that you saw in them. It feels good. And there's a lot of power behind sharing that gratitude and that love. So take a moment in your day, not right now, but take a moment later after the show and let that person know. And one thing that we know from everything that we have learned in positive psychology is the number one thing for our well-being is other people. So, with that, we are going to now dive into our topic because other people are going to come into this topic as well. So, today's topic is really different. It's so unique. And Lisa and Stella had approached me and said, "Hey, what do you think if we talk about trauma on the show?" And we know that that word can be taboo. We know that it can feel like it's something that does not belong in the workplace. And most of our leaders, most of our listeners are leaders or HR professionals in organizations. And what we like to do as humans is compartmentalize. It's like, ooh, that topic goes here. That person goes here. When we're in this space, this is what shows up here. And the reality is that's impossible. So we are only one person who shows up in absolutely every single domain in our life. And if you're trying to be somebody else in the different domains, chances are you're not doing a good job at it and it doesn't feel good in your body. So the reason Lisa and Stella said that they want to talk about trauma is not to go deep into the trauma per se, but more importantly, to be able to look at trauma and see how does that inform who we are and how might that actually be a benefit and a gift that we can use in our life. I'm not even going to say in our work, but in our life. So our work and our personal life and all around. So I always like to define terms before we really dive deep into a topic. Can you explain what are we talking about when we talk about trauma? And then we'll start to look at how does that, coincide with leadership? But let's start with trauma.
Sure. For the purposes of this podcast, Ilene, what I'd like to do is sort of say that trauma is the conditions that made you feel unsafe and overwhelmed and then alone with those feelings as a kid. Okay. The alone part is really important, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But trauma is really the big T things that we are all used to. It's life experiences like growing up in a home with domestic violence or growing up in a home with addiction, right? And it's the small T things too, like having your feelings invalidated as a child or as an adolescent, or needing to be very self sufficient from a very early age can feel like trauma to people. And what we know is that most adults have experienced trauma in their lifetimes. We are not a trauma-free society. If anything, we are shaped by the trauma that we've had and the trauma of our ancestors who've come before us. So it really behooves us to turn towards this trauma and see how those dynamics are playing out in our lives, in our relationships, at work, as you said, because it's by turning towards it that we can work with it. But when we avoid it, we really are compartmentalizing, as you said, and causing some ramifications and ripples that actually create more trauma.
Yeah. I really appreciate that what you said about we live in a society where the vast majority of people have experienced some trauma at some time. I mean, it could be in middle school, some of the icky stuff. I was going to say yicky, but icky stuff that happens in middle school with friends. It doesn't necessarily, I'm assuming, based on the work that you've been really diving deeply into, is it could be friends or people you thought were friends. It could be family. It could be in a work environment. But trauma can come from all different sources at any stage of life.
Correct. And what we know is that over 63% of people have had an adverse childhood experience in their lifetime, just one. Oftentimes we have more than one. If we have more than four, our central nervous systems are reconditioned to actually see the world through filtered sort of trauma lenses. And we look at the environment in a way that sort of perceives threat sometimes when there isn't threat. But trauma is everywhere.
But the good news is that it's also an opportunity it's an opportunity and an edge for us if we're willing to integrate it and resolve it and heal it within ourselves. And so we all have had some form of trauma. And what Lisa and I have really been working on articulating is this concept of a leadership edge. And your leadership edge is what we call it's the growth that's calling to you. It's when we look at the unexamined aspects of ourselves and accept them, integrate them, and are able to unlock new capacities within ourselves. So it's not just, in the workplace, we talk about growing as leaders. We do leadership development programs. We learn different skills, and we can be in the best of programs. However, we can stay stunted in our past if we're not willing to look at these traumas. And so what Lisa and I are working on articulating is, just the potential that can be unlocked and the healing that can happen, not just within one person, but within a group, if we're willing to look and be with it and allow it to heal.
What brought the two of you to this topic and to collaborating on this topic? I want to go there. I know, obviously, both of you are on the SVC team. You've been doing coaching, executive coaching for years and years and years, and this is a newer topic for you. So how did that arise?
I'll say that we oftentimes share our coaching experiences with one another, Eileen, obviously confidentially.
Sure.
We only work with themes and we're not using names or identifying clients' organizations. But what we see in our friendship when we talk about our relationships with our leaders and our clients is that a lot of them are still using these very protective mechanisms, these very adaptive mechanisms that they used as a kid to keep them safe and to deal with these very overwhelming feelings. But now those adaptive mechanisms are limiting them. And so we sometimes kind of laugh at the humanity of that, or we are amused and honestly find peace when we talk to each other about our own trauma, or we're talking about a client's trauma and sort of saying, wow, this is everywhere. This is everyone. And these adaptive mechanisms that were appropriate at one point in time that we give a lot of respect to are now sabotaging these leaders, in the workplace. So I would say that's one of the things that sort of brought us together on this topic, just was the commonality of seeing it in our work. Stella, what do you think?
Lisa and I both do a lot of our own work, on ourselves, a lot. And so I know that when I was writing my book, I was sharing with Lisa, like all the things that I was discovering about my own trauma, and kind of trying to figure out what I was going to share or not in the book. And I end up sharing a bunch, but we stumbled upon a polyvagal theory, and that really, I think, connected a lot of dots for us around the body's response to threat and how that's generated, and the relationship of trauma to how that shows up in the workplace and in our own lives. Um, so yeah, we're always comparing notes, and I think we especially compare notes when we marvel at the breakthroughs our clients have, because it's just this, it's an awe-inspiring moment to witness when you see someone break through some patterns that have been holding them back. And so that's very exciting to witness. It feels miraculous. It feels like when you see that, you're like, okay, it gives you hope for humanity.
That couldn't have been better said. You're so right. That's mainly where we do connect, is less on the trauma, Stella. I'm so glad you're reminding me of that, and more on the transformation.
Yeah.
And how intoxicating that is as coaches and psychologists, to see people break free of patterns that are no longer appropriate for them. And quite frankly, heal relationships moving forward. Because when the trauma is integrated, what happens is that they don't pass it to their children, their children's children, etc. So you're right. That's really the inspiring part.
Yeah. Well, and this is a good lead into the title of today, which is Trauma and Your Leadership Edge. So you have the trauma. Now if you could define, what do you mean by leadership edge? So we kind of get all our definitions out there before we play with it, because I want to have some examples that we can share so that people know how it might show up at work, and some stories that might help illuminate that. But before we do that, how do you define the leadership edge?
Yeah. So we talk about your leadership edge as the growth that's calling uniquely to you. So it's the unexamined aspect of yourself that, if you accept, will benefit you and those around you. So your team, your family, because we all suffer when someone is being triggered by their trauma. And while leadership development includes building new skills and adopting new habits and building your network, when we talk about leadership edge, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is something that can't be embraced by just learning or building. It's something that is actually about unlearning. It's actually about unlearning patterns that are no longer appropriate for you. It's about actually being present and, I don't know if the right word is unhinged, but not being run by your past, but being able to respond to the present moment without necessarily becoming inflamed by your past.
Yeah. So I'm assuming that's where that breakthrough point comes, if you're talking with a client and you're starting to see patterns that could have resulted from trauma, it's that breakthrough tipping point, if you will, to the aha of, oh, wow, if I look at this and take this, it can turn into this leadership edge.
Yeah. Ilene, we're going to talk more about this, but just to make it concrete for listeners, what we mean is, if you had to be hyper vigilant as a child to feel safe in your body and in your environment, that hypervigilance can play out at work as micromanagement, being in the weeds, suffocating people with your overbearingness, right?
Yeah.
If you were someone who needed to defer or appease a lot as a child in order to create harmony in your environment and be safe in who you are, then that could be playing out at work, if you're a leader, as not making a decision, as deferring on everything, as being overcome by events because you're unwilling to make a choice that could disappoint people or could create a little bit of disharmony in the team. Those ramifications magnified by the lens of your positional power, those things become huge liabilities for you as a leader. And there's an opportunity for you to heal your past in order to inform your present and really create the conditions for you and others to be much more effective and happy.
Yeah. One thing that's you're saying that's coming up for me is I can imagine our listeners might be self-identifying. They also might be seeing some of these things in the people who they work with, whether it's their manager, whether it's a colleague. Maybe it creates a little self-compassion, but compassion for others too.
Totally. We talk about how, when your trauma is showing up, in some ways you're almost replicating it, and now others are suffering from it. And then when you are able to spot it and identify it within yourself, it gives you a new appreciation for the hidden parts of everyone and that we all have them. And so it makes you bigger. It helps you have a bigger container for others.
Yeah.
And that gives a leader more patience and more curiosity when something's up, to really try to understand what's really going on here, and to help someone out of a difficult situation.
Yeah. How might that, and again, I want to ask you some kind of case studies or some specific examples, but still, I want to follow up on that. How might a leader, if they do see this in somebody and you've listened to this podcast and you're thinking, oh, wow, you just kind of assume people arrive where they are with no history. And when we stop to think, we know that's not the case. Everybody brings baggage everywhere to every relationship, right? I mean, that's part of the human journey. What if you do see something in somebody and you're now thinking, I wonder if there's something underlying this that's informing how they're showing up? How do you handle that?
That's such a great question. I think as a leader, if you're noticing it, I mean, the first thing you could do is just make someone aware of their behaviors, and help them recognize that maybe they're not even aware of some patterns that they're exhibiting. So to make the pattern conscious is what Lisa and I talk about. That's the first thing you want to do. So you want to identify the context of the situation, the people, or the conversation, and get curious. Like, I noticed you behave, I noticed that, when we were having this conversation, you started to get really short with Amy. Can you help me understand what was going on for you? And just getting curious. Sometimes people don't even realize. So that would be just to try to understand. And then also sometimes these are things that can't be dealt with alone. So you might want to suggest a coach. You might want to suggest a mentor. You might want to suggest, it could be related to trauma. It could not be. So we just have to seek to understand, and then to hold the space and offer compassion. So without judgment. And as a leader, one of the biggest things we can do is because our moods are contagious, our emotions are contagious. So if we can occupy some groundedness and sturdiness within ourselves, that deep presence will actually transmit to the person that we're listening to. And that in and of itself can be quite supportive, for someone to recognize and even adjust spontaneously. So we can't underestimate the power of our presence and our generous listening, which often goes, I think,
Unappreciated.
Unappreciated. Thank you.
Yeah.
Sure.
That in the science, Ilene, is called co-regulation, where we use our bodies as instruments to harmonize with the other and allow them to come back home to a place of safety and security in themselves. So whatever was triggering and traumatic to them can be looked at with more generous eyes, because you're holding a space of non-judgment as their leader. You're holding a space of acceptance and curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite quotes about trauma is that it's not the absence of adversity. Trauma is not the absence of adversity. It is the presence of connection. So we inevitably start to heal trauma when we are connected and attuned to one another, and we create space for people to connect patterns in themselves and sort of say, do I really want to be run by that pattern, or do I want to shift into a more optimal way of being now?
Yeah. Yeah. So what I hear is first that awareness. Everything starts with awareness, right? If we're not aware, then we're not going to address it. But first that awareness, and then stopping oneself and thinking, now what do I want to do with this?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're talking about two different things. Like, one, I think trauma identification is hard to do for other people. It's hard to sort of say, like, you're traumatized and you're being triggered right now, and I'm not going to talk to you. Or like, let's take this conversation offline and have it later, because that pointing out in and of itself can feel traumatic to people, right?
Yep.
What we'd love to do is have leaders start to take responsibility for some of their
That's what I was thinking.
And their trauma. I think that that's a little easier and more palatable in the workplace than trying to be the psychologist that's diagnosing everybody else's trauma.
Well, and we want to make sure that people leave knowing, do not diagnose. It was, thank you. do not. Thank you for clarifying. I was asking if a leader for themselves, it's first being self-aware. I apologize because I hopped topic. So I asked Stella one question that was regarding, if you notice this in someone, how might you be able to show up and be supportive in showing up? And then Stella answered that. And then I was saying, if we're noticing that in ourselves, it's that first awareness. And then what do I want to do with it? So two separate things. And thank you, Lisa, for clarifying that. I think it would be great to give an example of someone who you've worked with where this has come up and how they've had that breakthrough to the leadership edge.
I think this work was born out of one example that I shared with Stella. And then she was like, oh, and then I have this other example. And all of a sudden we were off and running on this topic. So there was a leader that I was coaching. Her name was Amal. And she came to me because she had been passed up for promotion 3 times. And she was at her wit's end. She was so frustrated. She was a financial executive. And she kept getting this feedback from her interviews that said that she really needed to strengthen her executive presence, and she needed to speak more clearly and concisely about her accomplishments. And she's like, I'm doing this, or I think I'm doing this, but she just kept getting passed up for promotion. So when we dug into her past, and I want you to know this didn't take a long time, this was fast, this was in the first session, Amal described to me that she was scared most of her childhood. She was raised in a culture and a family where women weren't permitted to make their own decisions. Everything from what she studied to who she married was determined by the men in her family. And she saw this pattern of her childhood show up now at work. We just started to connect the dots. So when she was speaking to people in positional authority, like in an interview, she doubted herself a lot. And she had a hard time organizing her thoughts and trusting her own competence, even though she had a track record of success, right? And although she had like always achieved her goals in her role, and she was constantly given awards in her company, she routinely attributed that success to others or to her team or to luck, because that's what she did when she was a child in her family. That's what it meant to get along in that family. So Amal's leadership edge was learning to listen to herself and trust herself. And she began to practice that in low stakes situations. So she, we created some scenarios where she could practice trust, self-trust, right? She began sharing her preferences and experiences and opinions with friends and peers. And she ultimately benefited, Ilene, from doing some skill building around presentations so that she had that in her next interview. But what we started to notice is that she was retaining her power and she was able to promote her ideas in contexts where she normally would have doubted herself. So when she was speaking up to people in positional authority, she was starting to put her ideas together more concisely and more thoughtfully, because she was trusting herself a lot more, because she had practiced. How do I communicate my preferences? How do I communicate my accomplishments? And that's how we were able to gauge her sort of transformation and her sort of letting go of, again, like I said, very adaptive, helpful strategies of the past that were now trauma responses in the present that were no longer working for her.
What did she notice as a result of that?
Well, she noticed, I think, just an inner confidence, right? An ability to stay emotionally regulated in the face of people who were in a position of authority, right? When she grew up, the men in her life, her brother and her father, were making a majority of the choices for her. And she didn't trust herself. She didn't have a way of learning how to trust herself and her competence and what she was feeling. But when we practiced a lot more of that, and I think it's really kind of unusual for people to think about practicing trust, self-trust. But when we practiced it, she was able to not get triggered in the face of authority. She was able to say, this is what I've accomplished and I'm proud of it. And here's the impact it made. So we're still waiting to hear whether she gets her next promotion. But I'm more confident that she will. And she is also feeling more confident that she will.
Wow. Well, and as you're talking, it just makes me think she's creating new neural pathways too. And so the more she practices, the more that becomes kind of the cleared pathway for her to keep going down. So you'll have to circle back with us and let us know. So, and any other thoughts on just someone who you might be able to share, Stella? Anything coming up for you in terms of a case study that might be a good example so that people can see this in action?
Sure. So I have a client who is chief, let's say a C-suite executive who was getting feedback that he was presenting as a bully and a bottleneck to a lot of his staff. And he was deemed as very controlling, very aggressive, and it was really setting the team back and creating a rift. And so when we looked into his past, we found that, and I just want to say for Lisa and I, what we noticed when we were talking about this, just as a quick aside, is that in coaching, you typically really don't go deep into someone's past. And so I think Lisa and I organically do this because we get curious and we want to know a little bit more. But now more and more, what we're realizing is that it's very important for us to understand. And I think um, a lot of people are connected enough to understand their past, and they have clues. So, I learned that he had some abuse in his childhood. From a father and who was also a drunk. And when, while he didn't, while he wasn't abusive to the people in his life, physically abusive, his anger and his over control and his rigidity to procedure exemplified this kind of desire to take control. And so his leadership edge, what we call kind of the growth that was calling to him, was this ability to collaborate with more compassion and trust in his team, to actually to have them suggest innovations or better ways of doing things, to have more allowance for what was going on, or to at least be curious as to why things weren't working versus to be uh, punishing people essentially. And so what he did as a result was he was able to acknowledge the impact that he had publicly and even ask for forgiveness. He was able to operationalize some solutions. So he actually took himself out of certain processes and gave other people permission to approve things. So he wasn't a constant bottleneck and controlling every aspect of the process. So there were some very practical things. But I also think with Lisa's case as well, we don't know if she got her promotion yet. She's waiting to hear. But ultimately, I think what the clients recognize within themselves is this profound growth. And that is very gratifying. That is a release and a level of freedom and very empowering, which they can then apply in many different ways.
I want to just dovetail on that. That growth that they notice also comes with a ton of self-compassion. Yeah. So we often want to hide away our trauma. We often sort of think like, obviously it doesn't belong at work, but that it doesn't belong anywhere. Like nobody should see it. But I think when we look at these two cases, both of these individuals were able to appreciate how important their trauma responses were as a child. So Amal deferred to get along, right? And this executive that Stella worked with, he felt so unsafe as a kid that he was always trying to find places that he could control, right? So that was really adaptive when you're 0 to 18. But then playing that out at work, it becomes less supportive to the executives that they want to be. And so they have a lot of compassion for, wow, that was really smart for me to do that as a kid. Wow, that was really necessary and sufficient. I don't need to punish myself for that. But what I can do is take responsibility for being different to a different context where I'm no longer that scared, overwhelmed child. I have the capacity now to shape the experiences of people around me, and I don't want that to be traumatizing. So I think they recognize this growth. They also recognize a profound appreciation for who they were as children and how smart they were to respond to what felt traumatic to them with the resources that they had at the time.
Absolutely. What I'm hearing is there's a delayed sense of empowerment or feeling like, wow, I'm proud of myself. And I also, as I'm hearing you both talk, you just think about the ripple effect for their teams. And Stella, in your case, there was, perhaps an apology and showing up so differently. I can imagine engagement goes up significantly in the team. Psychological safety goes up in the teams when we are able to step back and see this in ourselves. And I do want to point out, which Stella and Lisa talked about, coaching is different than going to therapy. Coaches are not therapists. There might be some coaches that are also therapists. So I want to make that distinction. And as coaches, we do refer out a lot to therapists. A lot of my clients I know already come to me with a therapist. And so I do want to stress is if this is bringing up anything for you listeners, it is really important for you to be able to get the help that you want and need and deserve in a therapeutic setting. So contacting a therapist or psychologist, and working with coaching can also help for you to, as you kind of maybe dive deeply, now be able to recognize patterns at work and how to move through those patterns and start to create new pathways to success for yourself. So I want to kind of make that distinction there. And as we wrap up now, gosh, there's so much good stuff here and really invaluable information. If we were to bottom line it, what would each of you say is the big takeaway that you hope our listeners leave with?
Well, I think just to recap what Lisa so beautifully put is that our trauma response patterns were once adaptive and very protective. However, they can be in present day very destructive at work. And so what we want to do is help folks recognize their power in unwinding their past. So they're no longer restricting their perception of reality. So they're no longer limiting the choices that they have. So they're not sabotaging their relationships and staying stuck in the past. So by partnering with a mental health professional or a coach, and doing the work, leaders can really unlock the hold that their trauma has on them and really resource themselves.
One thing you said, Stella, just made me think of that statement. What got me here won't get me there. Yeah. And so I think really thinking about the protective mechanisms and what you've done to take care of yourself in such a beautiful way to get you through that trauma and get you to here now maybe needs a different pathway forward. Lisa, what about you? A big takeaway?
Ilene, I think the takeaway for me is that working with a healthcare professional is the gold standard, but it doesn't need to be the bottleneck.
Right.
Okay. So I think we didn't talk a ton about what leaders can do for themselves, but I want to hit that really fast because I think it's really, really important that if you're seeing yourself as reactive, that you start to make those patterns conscious. You start to name them. And that gives you a lot of power. And you don't need to wait to go see a therapist to do that. Mm-hmm. Okay. You start to look at the places where you're constantly triggered. I think you can then, yes, go see a therapist or a coach to learn how to feel your feelings and do it with someone else. Remember what I said, that trauma is healed when we're in the presence of connection. And if you can feel your feelings with someone else who's regulated, your body will learn a different way to respond to the things that originally triggered you. So you can recondition your automatic responses. And it doesn't need to be a therapist or a coach. It could be like a dear friend or a mentor as well, right? Yeah. You can learn self-compassion. You can see, as we've said so many times, that early defense mechanism was great and necessary for your survival. And you can acknowledge where you want to choose a different response now. You can develop a stress cycle completion practice, right? You can do something for your body that moves the trauma through. You can breathe, you can exercise, you can develop a creative outlet. That again does not require a third party. You can take responsibility for that as a leader. And then also you can start to craft new stories for yourself about what you've learned through the trauma. So you can start to create a hero's journey. And I think all of those takeaways or possibilities start to help us free ourselves from the past and are really adaptive. And leaders, like Stella said, have the power to do that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, Lisa. Kind of it starts with you and then you can move forward. Let's go with one tiny, very first step. You threw out a lot of things, Lisa, what people can do. So I'm going to ask each of you. It can only be one. What is your recommended very first step?
Well, I guess I would pause. I would pause and I would pause and get curious and label your emotion. We know through research that just labeling your emotion, giving it a name, recognizing it, it helps you metabolize that emotion faster. It also helps move activity from the amygdala, so the fight or flight center, into the prefrontal cortex, the executive function. So it actually helps you come up with ways through the experience that you're dealing with. So I think labeling it, slowing it down, it helps you be with your emotion rather than override it. So I would become more well-versed in what is coming up and allowing yourself to slow down enough to really feel it and be like, oh, what's up? Like, that's what I say to myself sometimes. I'll go in the shower, like, what's up with you, Stella? Like, what's this really about? Where do you feel it? Like, I have a conversation, I have a conference with myself. And I think folks can do that too.
All right. So I'm going to just bottom line yours. It's pause, reflect, and name what's going on. Okay. Lisa.
Mine is the same, but I use one word and it's attune. It's attune. So tune into yourself. If you can, share that attunement with others. If you're triggered, I hope that other person could be regulated. What we don't want is too triggered people. And then if you're regulated, how can you share that regulation with others who are not feeling that?
Yeah,
So that attunement is really my first place to start.
All right. What is possible when someone becomes trauma aware and is able to become a more effective leader by having that knowledge?
When you are less reactive and more emotionally regulated, you're free from your past. And you create safer working environments for everyone around you. So I think that's what's possible. That safety, Ilene, fuels innovation. We get better outcomes. The organization has more success because we're not recycling our past. Yeah. We're actually building a future. That's what's possible.
What I'm hearing is instead of being stuck, there's growth.
Yeah, there is. There's, it's just an opportunity to not be run by patterns of the past.
Stella, what is possible?
Oh my God. What Lisa said was so beautiful. I think a big reason why so many people feel like they don't like where they work is there's just a weird vibe. They show up and there's weird vibes. It doesn't feel safe. They feel uncomfortable. They're questioning themselves. They're stressed to present themselves in a certain way. And oftentimes we tend to think that something's wrong with us. But often what's really happening is that when leaders don't do their work, it just creates a level of discomfort. And people don't trust themselves. People feel they question themselves. They internalize the discomfort that leaders feel within themselves. And that creates exactly what Lisa said. It's just people become stuck and it feels icky and it feels uncomfortable.
A leader creates a de facto program in an organization. They create a norm. They create a culture around them. And if that culture is one that's informed by trauma, what happens is that other people start to resonate with that trauma and they start to see the places in themselves that feel traumatized. And so what we have is just trauma bouncing off of itself at work. And that's what creates this sense of, I don't want to go there. I don't want to be in that. So it's a leader's responsibility, I believe, because they're stewarding the energy of multiple people in an organization to sort of say, I can look at this. I can make peace with this. I can choose to be different so that the people around me can also be their highest self at work.
That is so beautifully stated, Lisa. And I thank you both for diving into, again, what for so long has been a taboo topic that it doesn't serve us well to keep this as a taboo topic. It is a topic that needs to be out there and for each of us to appreciate in ourselves the beauty and the pain that has gotten us to where we are, and to now say, how do I want to take this beauty and pain and move it in the direction that I want to go? And the only way we can do that is to recognize every part of ourselves and to think about, how do we want to continue to not only survive, but thrive in work and life? So thank you both for sharing wisdom, sharing stories, and being with me today. But before you leave, if a leader is listening and thinking, gosh, I want to dive more into this, besides the fact they could contact Silicon Valley Change and set up a session with you, what book would you recommend? Is there one book that you think would really help somebody in this space?
I love Gabor Mate's book, When the Body Says No, because that really shows the connection between how abandoning ourselves or not listening to ourselves, not recognizing our trauma can lead to devastating chronic health conditions, and that we can't power through this.
I love Attuned by Thomas Hübl that really speaks to the power of doing our own work in order to heal the world. I also think the reason that we got into this work cannot be overlooked. Polyvagal Theory, A Pocket Guide by Stephen Porges is what opened the door for actually so many of these scientists to continue to do work, and for mystics right now to do work, because it's like fueled by hard science. So those two.
All right. And then I get to add one. The Work Happiness Method by Stella Grizont. You really beautifully address some of this in your book as well. So thank you both so much for being here, for sharing, being vulnerable, and putting the great work that you do into the world. I appreciate you both. This podcast is a catalyst for your leadership and well-being journey. To step deeper into exceptional leadership, visit svchange.com for personalized support that will take you to the next level. If you find this show meaningful, please hit that follow or subscribe button. It helps more people find what's possible organically. If you have questions about anything we've talked about, please drop me a line at podcast@svchange.com. I read every email I get, whether that's an episode idea, a guest recommendation, or just a simple note about how the show has impacted you. I'd love to hear from you. I'm Ilene Schaffer. Thanks for listening. What's Possible is produced by the team at Palm Tree Pod Co. The executive producer is Anthony Palmer. Thanks to Emily Miles and Caitlin Krings for video and digital support. The content for this podcast is created by Ilene Schaffer and the team at Silicon Valley Change.